Get started on 2 days of many papers. I hope it proves to be as fun as it was when we first started thinking about it. So our first panel should be moderated by Lisa Del Sol, one of my close co-organizers in this endeavor. Unfortunately, she had emergency surgery on Wednesday and is not able to be with us. We'll have a more formal announcement about the Frederick Ewan lecture series that we're part of and how this fits in with that at our keynote before dinner. And this panel now is going to be moderated by Mobina Hashmi in Media Studies here at Wilson College.
Hello everyone, welcome. Good to see you all bright and early on a Friday. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel today. Our first speaker is going to be Caitlyn Beach, and her paper is on, oh wait, I should turn them. There we go. Can you hear me? I guess you can hear me. Caitlyn Beach, her paper is Emancipation Without Indebtedness on Francesco Pezzicar. Pezzicar is the Abolition of Slavery. Caitlyn is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, where she studies American and European art of the long 19th century. Caitlyn has been the recipient of fellowships from the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. At present, she is the 2016-2018 Wyeth Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts of the Slavery and Commerce in 19th Century Atlantic Spaces. Her writing on sculpture and other topics has appeared in NACA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, 19th Century Art Worldwide, and in exhibition catalogs on American art. So with that, I give you Caitlyn Beach.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and I also wanted to thank the organizers of this conference for putting together these 2 days. I'm looking forward to all the papers and conversation, and thank you also everyone for coming bright and early this morning. So let's get started. Oh. All right. In 1873, the sculptor Francesco Pezzicar completed The Abolition of Slavery in the United States, 1863. The over-life-size statue depicted an African-American man with arms outstretched, one wrist bearing a broken shackle, holding over a head a fragment of bronze inscribed with text from the Emancipation Proclamation. As scholars have observed, this work stands out as one of the few freestanding sculptures of the 19th century to depict a formerly enslaved person. Created in the Austro-Hungarian city of Trieste by an Italian-speaking artist, The Abolition of Slavery made its official public debut on the other side of the Atlantic in 1876 at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. Its reception at the fair, however, remains yet to be fully explored. My paper today will consider the terms by which the statue is received, illuminating the ambivalent and often paradoxical terms by which sculptural bodies entered into dialogues about slavery, freedom, and indebtedness in decades after the Civil War. What follows will emphasize 2 points. At the time it was exhibited, Pezzicar's sculpture was unprecedented in its depiction of a former bondsperson as a powerful instigator rather than indebted recipient of his own liberation, a reality that many 19th century viewers recognized as radical and forceful. Yet other period commentaries complicated this picture, delimiting the sculpture's capacity to make meaning by inserting it in narratives that rehearse structures of race and power themselves formed under slavery. It's crucial to begin by noting how Pezzicar's sculpture differed from other 19th century sculptures produced about abolition. The same year the abolition of slavery was unveiled at the Centennial, Thomas Ball's monument to emancipation was dedicated in Washington. The bronze sculpture depicted a black man with wrists in shackles, kneeling before Abraham Lincoln. As the art historian Kirk Savage has noted, the monument's visual logic fit in with a narrative of abolition that conceived of former bondspersons as indebted subjects, rather than active agents in their liberation. By contrast, Pezzicar's sculpted figure stands alone in a stance that connotes solidity and strength. More significant yet, the figure's outstretched arms and broken chains suggest he has played a central role in securing his own liberation. Pezzicar modeled a corporeally capacious statue that engaged space in a dynamic way. The figure steps forward with a stride accentuated by a flowing wrap at the waist and a broken fragment of chain at the statue's base. The work scale, so large and spatially diffuse that its casting was completed in several pieces, further lends the figure a commanding presence. The statue measures 7 feet 8 inches high and approaches a colossal scale when placed atop an additional pedestal, as it was during the 19th and early 20th centuries. If Ball's shackled ex-slave kneels beneath Lincoln with the arc of his back ensconced by the president's extended arm, it is the viewer of Pezzicar's sculpture who must duck beneath and conform their body to the space occupied by the figure, initiating a phenomenologically active engagement with the negative space of the freestanding three-dimensional object that was unprecedented in 19th century sculpture. The figure represented by the abolition of slavery is over life-size, dynamic, and powerful. As one period critic noted, quote, "The attitude is impressive and full of vital force," end quote. When exhibited at the Philadelphia Centennial, the abolition of slavery drew a wide range of responses, from critique to derision to ambivalence. For many viewers, Pezzicar's larger-than-life-size dynamic figure of a freed slave held potential to be politically provocative. In what follows, I'll track the ways in which that possibility was acknowledged and framed. In making a claim to the politicized nature of Pezzicar's sculpture at the Centennial, it's helpful to briefly consider the intertwined history of emancipation, images, and activism in Philadelphia, a city well known as a hub of the American anti-slavery movement. In the mid-19th century, Henry Brown absconded slavery by mailing himself in a box from Richmond to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, where he recalled how he, quote, "stood erect before my equal fellow men, no longer a crouching slave," end quote. This event was commemorated in a lithograph by local Philadelphia printers and circulated widely, joining an already established visual culture of anti-slavery imagery that also included mezzotint reproductions of Nathaniel Jocelyn's famed portrait of Sengbe Pie, or Cinque, who led a revolt on the Spanish slaver Amistad in 1839. As scholars have noted, images such as these stood as important visual anchors for the politics of anti-slavery activism and Pan-African nationalism in 19th century Philadelphia. It was Jocelyn's portrait of Cinque that the Philadelphia African Methodist Episcopal Church had in mind when they reviewed Pezzicar's sculpture at the Centennial. Newspaper correspondent R.D. Dove hoped that the sculpture might be as effective as the portrait had been decades before, writing, quote, "We are all familiar with the portrait of Cinque, the hero of the Amistad, who himself struck the blow for liberty. But if Mr. Jocelyn, in transferring to canvas the African liberator, has been very successful, the case was different for Pezzicar." Dove wrote, and I quote, "So true it is to nature that it seems a great bronze photograph. One regrets that it is formed of such enduring material. The subject should have been endowed with beauty of form, grandeur of action, and an ideal development approaching the heroic." Dove grounds his anxieties about what the sculpture was, and moreover was not, in relationship to an aesthetic ideal to which images might be held and judged. His comments on what the sculpture should have been evoke the language of 18th century art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann, whose famous pronouncement that representations of the human figure must evoke noble simplicity and calm grandeur remained a touchstone for sculptors and their critics well into the late 19th century. It's crucial to bear in mind that Winckelmann's prescriptions were rooted in race and gendered terms of what an ideal body should be: heroic, male, and white. But as the art historian Kirsten Pye Buick has astutely noted in her discussion of neoclassical marble work by the African-American sculptor Edmonia Lewis, deploying the ideologies of dominant white culture in art, however raced and gendered those ideologies already were, could help assure that sculptural figures would signify neither the condition of enslavement nor stereotypes of race. That sculpture would be a powerful medium through which Reconstruction-era African Americans would explore histories of heroism is exemplified by the AME's hopes for and disappointment in Pezzicar's sculpture, as well as the church's project to erect a monument to their founding bishop Richard Allen at the Centennial. The monument was to feature a quarter-length bust depicting Allen in the plain dress that the bishop favored over clerical robes, and the AME envisioned that the Allen Monument might be a catalyst in their larger project of promoting racial uplift. Yet while Pezzicar's sculpture appeared in an official fair display, the Allen Monument was initially barred from exhibition and only displayed during the final weeks. This dialectic of presence and absence, inclusion and exclusion, speaks to the contingent terms by which Blackness would figure into the official space of the centennial, and the kinds of discourses of race in history it would prop up within that space. The exclusion of the Richard Allen Monument and narrative of the Pezzicar sculpture, as supported by mainstream white media, to which my attention now shifts, stand as part of a dominant white refusal to acknowledge the realities of Black subjectivities outside the frame of slavery in the slave past. White critical responses to the abolition of slavery are striking for how they worked to contain the work's capacity to make meaning. I'll focus here on one particular source that has gone unmentioned in existing scholarship on the sculpture, an account by diplomat Alexander Wheelock Thayer, the American consul living in Pezzicar's native Trieste and friend of the artist. In 1876, Thayer published a letter in a Boston newspaper in order to better illuminate the work as it stood on view at the centennial, and to offer an authoritative explanation for how and why Pezzicar created the abolition of slavery from Trieste, a city then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. According to Thayer, Pezzicar had learned of the abolition of American slavery the decade prior and looked to commemorate the event in sculpture. The artist based early maquettes for his work on two models, people of color from Trieste, an ethnically diverse port city on the Adriatic Sea. The result, wrote Thayer, was, quote, two fine expressive figures, but not truly African, end quote. He then recounted Pezzicar's search to find a model for his work in a passage worth quoting at length. Two vessels, the Supply and the Guard, belonging to the U.S. Navy, came to Trieste and remained here throughout the season. Several officers, Mr. Pezzicar thinks at the invitation of the U.S. consul, visited his studio and confirmed the consul's opinion that the statue was lacking in the characteristics of his race. Luckily, there was an employed on the Guard, an emancipated slave from North Carolina, shipped under the name of Brown, a fine type of his race. Lieutenant Hitchcock offered the services of this man to the sculptor, who gladly accepted them and patiently began his third full-size figure, which, with some 15 or 20 visits of Brown, was completed. The figure was seen to be a faultless copy of the man. What was at stake in Thayer's account, and in particular his emphasis on likeness, the body of the studio model, in faultless copies? On one hand, the rhetoric around truth and reality in Pezzicar's work evokes the terms by which many contemporary sculptures were evaluated. Auguste Rodin's Age of Bronze of 1876, for example, was said to be so remarkably real that many wondered whether the artist had created the nude figure directly from body casts of the model. Such attitudes were part of a larger sea change in sculptural practice and theory, particularly as it pertained to representations of the human figure. If the idealized white marble bodies of neoclassical sculptors like Canova, Thorvaldsen, and Powers had long reigned as the pinnacle of academic achievement for sculptors of previous generations, in later decades, artists began to explore other possibilities of how statuary could be made and what it might look like. Bronze was frequently championed over marble as a medium through which details of the human form could be rendered, and artists increasingly relied upon live models to achieve accuracy in sculpting pose and physique. Pezzicar's sculpture was certainly seen as a part of this broader shift in sculptural practice. In the 1870s, one critic proclaimed the work, quote, a major advance in statuary. The artist has distanced himself from classicism, aligning himself with a modern aspiration that seeks the truth in everything and for everything, end quote. Yet I want to stress here how the emphasis on truthful qualities of Pezzicar's sculpture was as much tied to essentializing ideas about race and slavery as it was sculptural modernism. Thayer writes at length of Pezzicar's search for a suitable model for his sculpture, deeming the local Trieste men who had originally posed for the statue, quote, not truly African, end quote, but the emancipated North Carolinian sailor, a, quote, fine type of his race. The first-hand history of the sculpture Thayer constructs is one at once embedded in the American slave past, and more invidious yet, the body of a former American slave, figured here as what the performance studies scholar E. Patrick Johnson would term an arbiter of authenticity, one that helps secure particular attributes of Blackness in an essentializing way. Per Thayer's account, the model's presence reportedly enables the artist to complete his work, and the finished sculpture is proclaimed a faultless copy of the man. As another contemporary viewer remarked, quote, "Let us simply note that the statue, superbly cast in bronze, affects much more, seems more natural, more alive, more speaking." The notion that Pezzicar's sculpture was so realistic it verged upon the lifelike was likewise foregrounded in a widely circulated image, an engraving published in Frank Leslie's Illustrated Historical Register of the Centennial. In the print, the sculpture does not appear as a static work of art, but is instead enlivened by the engraver's burin. The figure steps forth energetically and strides off the pedestal, whose exhibition tag hangs askew. African-American men, women, and children surround and study the work, with one girl reaching to touch the statue, as if to discern whether the body standing before her is metal or flesh. While some scholars see this engraving as a testament to diverse audiences at the Centennial, we also must be conscientious of the ways in which it may have reinforced notions of racial alterity rather than inclusivity in a periodical whose main audience encompassed white middle-class Americans. The engraving was one of many images of Centennial sculpture galleries published in the Historical Register, but remained the only one that depicted a work of art in the presence of non-white spectators. It also stood apart from other images that, without exception, rendered bronze and marble statues as static, specimen-like forms and outlined in a more schematic and simplistic style. In text and image, Pezzicar's sculptural body was continually construed as proximate to, and sometimes equivalent to, a human body. Thayer considered the sculpture a faultless copy of the man after whom it was modeled, a formerly enslaved North Carolinian sailor. This account stands as more than an anecdotal detail of the sculpture's conception, but rather as a testament to the structures of race and power informing the artistic production and criticism in the post-Civil War era. Art historians Kirk Savage and Michael Hatt have suggested that sculptures created about and after emancipation often risked reasserting the racial structures and power relations of slavery in a manner so that the visual economy of slavery is still operative, to paraphrase Hatt. In the case of Pezzicar's work, too, the racial hierarchies and proprietary violence of slavery inhered first in Thayer's account of a free man made by naval officers to enact the persona of an ex-slave in the artist's studio, a space conditioned by scrutinizing and objectifying gaze, and second, in the very notion of interchangeability between person and thing. It's well known the effects of slavery lingered long after the Civil War. If the 13th Amendment, ratified and made part of the Constitution at the close of 1865, formally abolished slavery throughout the nation, scholars across disciplines have shown the many ways in which the racist structures of power that enabled for centuries the enslavement of Black Americans did not simply cease to exist. As literary critic Stephen Best contends, and I quote, "Slavery is not simply an antebellum institution that the United States has surpassed, but a particular historical form of ongoing crisis involving the subjection of personhood to property," end quote. The Abolition of Slavery was a sculpture produced about and after emancipation, two phenomena that existed in tension and at times contradiction with one another. Pezzicar looked to commemorate the end of slavery with his work, and in so doing produced a singular and unprecedented figure of a free slave, monumental in both form and scale. Yet the sculpture's production and reception alike were contoured by the afterlives of the institution itself, as critics sought to manage the sculpture's meaning by reiterating racial hierarchies and locating it in the slave past. The sculpture's histories of reception gestured to the partial and contingent nature of emancipation, a reality to which the work itself perhaps inadvertently alludes. The text of the Emancipation Proclamation inscribed upon the fragment of bronze the figure wields overhead is interrupted by a series of ellipses, some longer than others, as we can see here. Yet, as we're able to see, the original Emancipation Proclamation, as authored by Lincoln and issued in the midst of the Civil War, was significantly longer and more complex. Pezzicar's act of omission transforms a military order rife with contingencies, technicalities, and expectations of what emancipation would assure and for whom it would be assured into a universalizing statement on freedom. The sculpture exposes the limitations of emancipation at the same time it proposes its possibilities. Thank you.
I'm just going to fix our AV setup a little bit before Can you guys see the presenter from here? If the screen is on this, okay. I'm just going to move this up. Are you going to come up here, Indya?
Oh, I'm still next?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that work for you?
Yeah, it's
Okay,
fine.
and this. Okay, I'll just read your intro, and we'll get your. So I forgot to mention that the title of the panel is Arts and the Lived Experience, as you might have guessed from Caitlyn's presentation. Our next presenter is Indya Jackson. Her paper is titled Afro-Pessimistic Perspective in Between the World and Me, or Death, or quote, Death was simply a part of the working of the trade, end quote. Indya Jackson is a PhD candidate in the Department of English at Ohio State University. Her research is most interested in literary nationalism of the Black arts movement. Jackson holds a bachelor's degree in English from Tuskegee University and a master's degree in English literature from the Ohio State University. And here is Indya.
Okay. So, as my project is one that's been ongoing, or it is one that's been ongoing, thus over the past few months, as these things go, I have narrowed my topic down a bit to really emphasize the role of mass incarceration in situating Ta-Nehisi Coates and what Abdul Arjan Muhammad refers to as a death-bound subject. So to reflect this development, the updated name of my paper is simply Coates as Death-Bound Subject, with the subtitle, Death Was Simply a Part of the Workings of the Trade. In this, the primary aim of my project is to assess the role of mass incarceration in the formation of Black identity. And a secondary aim, I hope, the ways in which mobilizing Afro-pessimism as a theoretical framework is useful to my project will become clear through the course of the presentation. All right. And so to begin, I want to start by reading a quote from Richard Wright's autobiographical work, Black Boy, American Hunger, published in 1945. In the text, Wright states, "Tension would set in at the mere mention of whites, and a vast complex of emotions involving the whole of my personality would be aroused. It was as though I was continuously reacting to the threat of some natural force whose hostile behavior could not be predicted. I had never in my life been abused by whites, but I had already become as conditioned to their existence as though I had been the victim of 1,000 lynchings." This quote reveals three things for me. First, what this quote brings up for me is how the Black body becomes subject to a racialized surveillance. More specifically, I'm interested in how Wright is elucidating a moment of recognition of the Black self. For me, as Wright is expressing a sort of innate antagonism with whiteness, I'm led to think of Frantz Fanon's 1952 essay, The Fact of Blackness from Black Skin, White Masks, in which he describes a moment of recognition. In this moment, a white child points to Fanon, or any Black person, and says, "Look, a Negro," which, not unlike in the case of Wright, reveals an overdetermined sense of self as a being trapped in the historicity of being a Negro. Also useful in this essay is Fanon's indication that a Black man is not a man, he's a Black man, a subject completely removed from the human world. Second, for me, this quote highlights the pervasiveness of lynching terror during this era. So though published in 1945, this moment is a reflection back on Wright's childhood in the 19-teens and 20s. According to a 2015 Equal Justice Initiative report, which uncovered 700 previously unnamed victims of lynching, there are nearly 4,000 documented cases of racial terror lynching in the southern United States between 1877, so the end of Reconstruction, and 1950. And so here I want to emphasize that these are only the documented cases in the southern states. I also want to emphasize that this number, 4,000, doesn't begin to account for the generational impact that these acts of terrorism had on communities from which these lynching victims were picked. The third way in which this quote has been generated for me is in its representation of the ubiquity of whiteness. In this quote, Wright very positively puts the surveillance of Blackness in direct connection with the ubiquity of whiteness. Here, for Wright, The whiteness is this always looming, ghostly, omnipotent specter. Whiteness is haunting. And so this now is where my project most conspicuously enters conversation with Afro-pessimism as a theoretical framework, which I'll refer to frequently as AP. Thus, I want to provide you with my working definition of Afro-pessimism and my mobilization of the term. Afro-pessimism is a school of thought which theorizes blackness as a position of accumulation and fungibility. This framework is invested in theorizing the structural relationship between blackness and antagonism. Important to note here is the difference between antagonism and conflict. Conflict is that which is reconcilable. Antagonism is not. Antagonism is irreconcilable. Additionally, I want to briefly touch upon three of the contributions of AP that shape my understanding of Black identity formation as present in the work of Richard Wright and his progeny, Ta-Nehisi Coates. First, necessary to understanding this structure and my work is the concept or the theory of natal isolation. Here, natal is doubly employed. Initially, natal isolation references the moment of a Black subject's inception within his mother's womb. AP theorizes that from this moment of inception, the Black subject is socially isolated or excommunicated from the rest of the world and or civil society. Additionally, natal isolation is linked to the hold of the slave ships. In this mobilization, the Atlantic Ocean is the womb and therefore the point of origin for African Americans. As we know, it is in the hold of the slave ship that Black persons from diverse ethnic groups, tribes, religions, regions, cultures, language groups, and histories, those who left Africa as Africans, through this violent melding, transformed into African Americans. In this moment, which created an ontological Blackness, I am also reading echoes of Richard Wright's concern with the surveillance of whiteness as a source of Black recognition. The afterlife of slavery as a second contribution I'd like to emphasize. So credit goes to Saidiya Hartman for developing this term. Not unlike Michelle Alexander, who theorizes a transformation from Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow rather than an end of de jure segregation, Hartman theorizes a transformation from slavery to the afterlife of slavery, in which there has never been a true emancipation from slavery, but a transformation of the tools and methods of enslavement. In this, I am able to understand Richard Wright's fear of lynching terror as one that still exists, yet in a new facade. Blackness' absence is the third contribution of Afro-pessimism that I'll discuss. In this phrase, what is being theorized is that white selfhood is predicated on the notion of Blackness as a negative or absence. Rather, Blackness allows for the construction of our present racialized social hierarchy. All other identities are formed in response to Blackness. As eloquently stated by Hartman, solidarity comes from a near or far relation to the Black body or bodies. We Blacks give the nation its coherence because we are its underbelly. For whiteness to exist, Black people must be the bottom. So I do want to kind of quickly show some of the theorists who have helped to kind of develop Afro-pessimism as a theoretical framework. Of the theorists who've contributed to the development of this framework, my work most prominently regards the work of Abdul Arjan Muhammad, particularly his 2006 publication, The Death-Bound Subject, Richard Wright's Archaeology of Death. In this text, Jan Muhammad analyzes several of Richard Wright's works while ultimately locating Wright as a death-bound subject. Death-bound subject is defined by Jan Muhammad as one who from infancy develops always under the imminent threat of death. As Jan Muhammad does this work, he parses through Wright's text to suggest that for Wright, it is the threat of lynching that positioned the writer as a death-bound subject. And so, finally, I do want to talk a little bit about the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates. Interestingly, the title from Between the World and Me comes from a Richard Wright poem. And so, in a short synopsis, in the text, which is an epistolary memoir written to Coates' son, Samori, Coates addresses his own experiences in a society that readily disembodies Black Americans with racialized violence and the myth of American exceptionalism. I want to reemphasize that what I am doing is reading Coates with Jan Muhammad's theory of the death-bound subject in coordination with Afro-pessimism to argue that mass incarceration and its accoutrements have replaced lynching as the terror which contemporarily shapes those death-bound subjects. So now I want to really briefly outline how I see Between the World and Me as echoing those three contributions of Afro-pessimism while dually evidencing Coates as a more contemporary death-bound subject who, unlike Richard Wright, is formed under the threat of mass incarceration rather than lynching. Of all the moments that Coates discusses during his childhood in Baltimore, one that particularly stands out to me is when Coates witnesses a light-skinned black boy with a long head and small eyes shoot another boy. In this moment, Coates finds himself in a blighted 1980s Baltimore, the product of public policy, including mass incarceration. The boy with the small eyes, writes Coates, reached into a ski jacket and pulled out a gun. I recall it in the slowest motion, as though in a dream. There the boy stood, the gun brandished, which he slowly tucked, then untucked once more. In his small eyes I saw a surging rage that could, in an instant, erase my body. That was 1986. That year I felt myself to be drowning in the news reports of murder. Here, I link Coates' recognition of the black body's fragility and his feeling of drowning to natal isolation. Likewise, I highlight a moment midway through the narrative in which a white woman pushes Samori, Coates' son, in her haste to catch a train. As Coates confronts this woman, a white man steps in and threatens him with the possibility of arrest. Coates writes, "A white man standing nearby spoke up in her defense. I experienced this as his attempt to rescue the damsel from the beast. He had made no such attempt on behalf of my son, and he was now supported by other white people in the assembling crowd. The man came closer. He said, 'I could have you arrested.' I did not care. I told him this, and the desire to do much more was hot in my throat. I came home shook. It was a mix of shame for having gone back to the law of the streets mixed with rage. I could have you arrested, which is to say, I could take your body." For me, this threat of incarceration encapsulates the concept of blackness as absence. In this case, for the white people involved, there is no way to understand their roles as the damsel and the defender without locating Coates as a black beast which is non-human or outside of the human world. Finally, there is the case of Prince Jones, a Howard University classmate of Coates who Coates describes as patron saint of the twice as good. Despite being from an exceptional black family and despite being exceptional himself, Jones is murdered under the lash of mass incarceration by an officer who is never charged for Jones's death. About the murder of his friend, Coates writes, I thought of all the beautiful black people I'd seen at Howard, all their variation, all their hair, all their language, all their stories and geography, all their stunning humanity, and none of it could save them from the mark of plunder and the gravity of our particular world. It occurred to me then that you would not escape, that there were awful men who'd laid plans for you, and I could not stop them. Prince Jones was the superlative of all my fears. In his seminal text on the post-colony, philosopher and political theorist Akili Mbembe describes the state of the slave as such. Slave, he writes, is the forename we must give to a man or woman whose body can be degraded, whose life can be mutilated, and whose work and resources can be squandered with impunity. A life squandered with impunity is the legacy of Prince Jones. And so for me, this moment regards how in this afterlife of slavery, Coates' fear of bodily plunder is sustained by the looming threat of mass incarceration. This reiterates the fact that, as suggested by Hartman, there has never been an end to slavery. And so, as previously noted, the subtitle of my work is Death Was Simply a Part of the Workings of the Trade. And so I want to end with a quote from Hartman's text, Lose Your Mother, which I found particularly helpful to understanding the nature of black abjection and what exactly has happened to my people in this country, why there are so many people who I must grieve, whose names I will never know. Hartman writes, "Death wasn't a goal of its own, but just a byproduct of commerce, which had the lasting effect of making negligible all the millions of lives lost. Incidental death occurs when life has no normative value, when no humans are involved, when the population is, in effect, seen as already dead. Unlike the concentration camp, the gulag, the killing field, which had as their intended end the extermination of a population, the African trade created millions of corpses but as a corollary to the making of commodities. To my eyes, this lack of intention didn't diminish the crime of slavery, but from the vantage of judges, juries, and insurers, exonerated the culpable agents. In effect, it made it easier for a trader to countenance yet another dead black body, or for a captain to dump a shipload of captives into the sea in order to collect insurance, since it wasn't possible to kill cargo or to murder a thing already denied life. Death was simply a part of the workings of the trade. Thank you.
Rebecca, do you have a present? Okay, so I'll just mute that then. Okay, great. So our third presenter today is Rebecca Powell, and her paper is titled Anti-Abolitionist Romance, The Discourse of Love and Slavery in 13th Century Castilian Texts. Rebecca Powell received a BA in Spanish Language and Literature from Columbia in 1999, and taught high school in Brooklyn for 13 years before returning to Columbia to study for a PhD in English. She presented a paper on Chaucer's House of Fame as science fiction at the biennial London Chaucer Conference in July 2015 and received her MPhil from Columbia in May 2016. She is currently working on a dissertation about how ideas about medieval and early modern Spain influenced the writings of African American intellectuals who spent time in Spain in the mid-20th century. Rebecca.
Thank you. So, can everyone hear me if I talk like this? Am I the right distance from the mic? Okay. Well, thank you now for something completely different, or not. So this panel is arts and the lived experience, and looking at Indya's abstract before this and listening to Caitlyn's paper, I thought, well, another name for it might be the news is not good. So my paper sort of backs up to the Middle Ages to figure out how we got here, which may seem like going very far back, but hopefully not. So specifically, I'm looking at the late 13th century to take a look at how medieval Castilians tried to soothe their consciences and resolve the tension between moral qualms about slavery and its economic utility by examining a pair of late medieval romances which allow a narrow path of escape for exceptional slaves, but at the same time reassure their readers that anyone who is recognized as deserving would be both protected from extreme suffering while enslaved and also would inevitably reach freedom, so therefore everything is fine. And so I think maybe some parallels may develop, I swear. So I'm interested in these late 13th century romances because they make their way into Castilian right around the time of Las Siete Partidas, which was the Alfonso X's monumental compilation of 13th century Castilian law, which remained the basis of Spanish law for centuries afterward, and in modified form continued to affect the Spanish-American colonies, and thus attitudes towards slavery in this hemisphere. Siete Partidas was part of the Castilian national unifying project, and as such, it attempted to provide a coherent ideological framework to unify an existing patchwork of Roman canon law, traces of Visigothic law codes, and even a bit of the Muslim laws of the southern half of the peninsula. So it's interesting to look at what the preamble to the section de los siervos concerning slaves says about slavery. Before a long and really detailed set of laws governing slaves, the preamble states, servitude, or servidumbre, is the most vile and despised thing that can be among men. For man, who is the most noble and free creature of all other creatures made by God, is placed by it in the power of another. And it goes on to say that slavery is against the logic of nature. So Alfonso X's law code proclaims that slavery is against divine law, but at the same time accepts it as a normal human institution. My contention is that the romances I'm discussing here try to bridge the gap between the legal preamble, which states that slavery is morally wrong, and the laws themselves, which paint it as an acceptable and even desirable piece of social and economic organization. And there it may actually be building on the Hartman a little bit too. The verse romance Libro de Apolonio and the prose romance the Crónica de Flores y Blanca Flor both rely on the heroine being enslaved as a major plot device. And those of you familiar with the tragic mulatto romances of the 19th century, I think there's a fascinating book to be written about parallels between them. And these two romances, along with the Doncella Teodor, which I'm not talking about here because of time constraints, share a profound ambivalence about slavery, which recognizes the pain, terror, and humiliation of the enslaved, but ultimately implies that virtuous slaves will triumph and be rewarded without a challenge to the system itself. These romances engage with fears about unjust or illegal exploitation of slaves, and at the same time reassure their audiences that slavery is a humane institution. I call them anti-abolitionist romances since they assure the reader that goodness, young love, and Christian virtue will prevail as long as both slaves and masters act within the law. I contend that the romances normalize slavery by using the language of courtly love to blur the distinction between powerful men, who are figuratively slaves to their beloveds, and women who are quite literally slaves to be bought and sold at auction by these same men. The stories contain scenes of kidnapping, auction, and threatened rape. However, the heroines of these romances maintain their chastity while reducing the noblemen around them to servitude as first lovers and then husbands. This is part of a larger project, so in the interest of time, I won't review the reasons why I believe you can meaningfully speak about social content in romances that obviously have some fantastic plot elements, except to say that the details of the way people became slaves, the types of work that enslaved women do, and the paths to manumission in these romances are grounded in accurate details of medieval Mediterranean slavery that would have been familiar to their original audiences. The romances also engage with the legal language of the Siete Partidas to suggest ways laws around slavery allowed for happy endings in ways that I hope to make clear. The Libro de Apolonio is older in terms of source material, and it's closely modeled on a late antique romance from about the 5th, 6th century, the Historia Apolloniae Regis Tyrae, or History of Apollonius, the King of Tyre, and it retains the setting of the Latin work. Because the Libro de Apollonio's source is so far removed in space and time from 13th century Iberia, the changes in vocabulary between the Latin text and the Castilian adaptation point to differences between medieval and late antique attitudes towards slavery. Phillips notes that ancient Rome was a slave society, meaning that nearly 1/3 of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves, and slave labor accounted for a major proportion of that society's production. Medieval Iberia, on the other hand, was a society with slaves, where slaves accounted for a small percentage of the population, and at no time was the economy dependent on slave labor. The anxiety about slavery in a society where it was much less pervasive phenomenon is evident in the way the Castilian author adapted his Latin source material. In the Latin Historia Apolloniae, slavery first appears with the introduction of the Vilicus, Theophilus, whom the villain Dionysius bribes to kill the heroine, Tarsia, by promising him freedom and a cash reward. Theophilus is sympathetic to Tarsia in the Latin, demurring at first and asking what crime she's committed. After Dionysius threatens him with violence if he doesn't obey her, he prepares for his task, sighing and weeping, and asking God whether he does not deserve to receive liberty without shedding the blood of an innocent virgin. The text does not explain how or why Theophilus became a slave and portrays his obedience to his mistress as unheroic but not actively evil. Teófilo, Theophilus' Spanish equivalent, is treated quite differently in the Libro de Apolonio. He is initially described as los de criación of Dionysus' household, that is, among those raised in it. And this echoes the formal legal category in the Siete Partidas of los criados de la casa, que no sean sus hijos, the servants, people raised in the house who are not the children of the master. This implies an unclear legal status somewhere between slave and servant and is close to the original Latin vilicus, a term which in classical Latin simply meant the overseer of an estate, whether slave or free. Teófilo's position is clarified, though, in the next lines when he's called a man of evil roots who lay in prison. Teófilo raises no moral scruples about killing an innocent girl, but rather proceeds directly to practical concerns about how and where to do so. Given that he lies in prison because of his innate evil, or raíz mala, showing moral scruples would not make much sense. In the slave society of the Roman Empire, no explanation was required for why a person was enslaved. by the time the vernacular Libro de Apolonio was written, slaves were unusual enough that the narrative required a justification for Teofilo's position. He's not merely a criado of Dionysius, but rather a man who is imprisoned because of unspecified crimes. In other words, by the late Middle Ages, slavery had to be a deserved fate. And I think these may be the deep ideological roots of the link between slavery and the carceral system. The idea of slavery as a captive of just war. The evolution of the vocabulary describing those who raided for slaves also suggests an increasingly legalistic view of slavery. In the Historia Apollonia, the young heroine Tharsia is captured by piratai, or pirates. In contrast, the 15th century Historia de Apollonio, yet another version, specifies that she's captured by corsarios, or privateers, who presumably make a living finding captives of just war, and are thus engaged in a legal, if somewhat unsavory, business. The 13th century Libro de Apollonio splits the difference by having its heroine captured and sold by ladrones, or thieves, a designation which suggests that it might be possible for non-pirates to legally capture and sell people, though this particular sale is dubious. The flagrantly illegal aspect about selling Tarsiana is not that she's a captive, presumably of just war, but that the brothel keeper who buys her attempts to force her into prostitution. Although such sales were hardly uncommon, it was technically illegal, according to the Siete Partidas, to force an enslaved person to be a prostitute, and there are extant cases of women who sued for their freedom on the grounds that they had been illegally forced into sex work. The way that Tarsiana frees the girls who are also captives in the brothel mirrors the legal penalty for forcing a slave into prostitution in the Siete Partidas. Several critics have noted the parallels between Tarsiana's experience in the Magdalene brothel and various hagiographies of St. Ines, St. Agatha, and others. However, as Paniatakis notes, unlike the Christian martyrs brought against their will to brothels, Tarsiana's virginity is not saved through any miraculous divine intervention. Rather, she works completely within the legal and non-supernatural framework of her situation, so that, and I quote, violence gives way to an emphasis on commercial exchange. The female body in this novel is primarily a means of financial exploitation. Tarsiana's improbable agency provides reassurance that slaves can defend themselves from being forced into prostitution without recourse to miracles, and proof that legal protections are adequate for good slaves, even without divine intervention. Although the characters in both the Latin and Castilian versions of the Apollonia story frequently seem to behave like Christians, the story officially takes place in pagan ancient Greece, which presents a problem in terms of Tarsiana's captivity. Religious difference was fundamental to an understanding of what made warfare and the taking of captives just, and Libro de Apollonio's archaic setting removes the real basis for what was called just war in the medieval Mediterranean world. On the other hand, religious differences and their implications for slave trading are explored far more fully in the Chronicle of Flores and Blancaflor. The emphasis on religious difference in Flores and Blancaflor hints at the beginning of ideas about slavery being the fate only of the other, as opposed to a condition that could encompass anyone who committed a crime or had the ill luck to be in a war zone. It also illuminates the ways religious difference marked the boundary of the human in ways that were transformed into racial categories in the early modern period. Unlike Tarsiana, Blancaflor, the heroine, is born captive, raised from birth as a slave, after her mother, the Christian Countess Bertha, is captured by Muslim raiders. Bertha and her daughter's slavery has a legal basis in their status as Christians in a Muslim kingdom, since, according to Hannah Barker, all free adults living in the Mediterranean region during the later Middle Ages could legally purchase slaves from religious backgrounds different than their own. While Blancafleur's status as a captive of just war is perhaps endangered by being made captive while still in utero, her Christian background functions as a mechanism for making her enslavement legal, as well as a symbol of her virtue for Christian readers. The Muslim queen of Almeria, for example, expresses her concerns about her son Flores's relationship with Blancaflor in terms of a religious difference that seems inborn rather than a matter of practice or belief. She wants Flores to marry a lady who is a pagan of our law because it seems inappropriate to me that our son be married to the child of Christians. Muslims would obviously not, sorry, I don't know what that is, but, yeah. So Muslims would not like describe themselves as pagan, obviously, but this is a Christian writer imagining how Muslims think, so cut him slack. So Flor's mother doesn't complain that Blanca Flor is a Christian, because technically Blanca Flor, because she's been born in Almeria, is not. She's baptized only at the end of the story, but rather that Blanca Flor is the daughter of Christians, suggesting Christianity is an inherited characteristic. This insistence on heritable religious difference is important in the context of reaffirming that Blanca Flor is undoubtedly a slave and is eligible to be sold to passing slave traders, which she is. Blanca Flor's status as a slave is crucial to the plot because it saves both Flor's life and her own. At the court of the Sultan of Babylon, when the Sultan puts Florus on trial because he discovers the lovers together, the prudent Admiral Tensor reminds him that he should not, for the sake of a slave woman you purchased with goods, do something that will echo to your discredit in foreign lands. The happy ending here is dependent on Blanca Flor's being not a noblewoman in her own right, but rather a captive who has been comprado por haber, purchased with goods. Florus has not offended the Sultan's honor by seducing her because she is legally an object and can thus be replaced with either cash or another girl of equivalent value. Florus frames his relationship with his beloved as bluntly as Tensor. This Blanca Flor is the daughter of a slave of my father's, and he gave her to me so that she should be mine. His motives are generous, but when Florus says his father gave him Blanca Flor so that she should be mine, he is speaking literally about a piece of chattel. While happy to address Blanca Flor as amiga y señora, my friend and my lady, in private, in open court, Florus makes clear that she is sierva, a slave, not señora. The prince implies he has a prior claim on Blanca Flor because the Sultan has purchased stolen property. Immediately afterward, Blanca Flor herself echoes Siete Partida's description of the duties of slaves. When Florus asks the Sultan to kill him and pardon Blanca Flor, she argues for the reverse by saying, I'm a captive, as he said, and it's far more right that I die for him than he for me. She appeals explicitly to the law, arguing that it is mayor derecho, both more right but also more lawful, that she die for Florus than he for her because she's a slave. Her words echo Title 21, Law 5 of the Fourth Partida, concerning the duties of slaves to their masters. Quote, any slave is obligated to protect his master and die for them to excuse them from death or dishonor. Blanca Flor bases her legal claim to die for Florus on the explanation he's just given the Sultan, as he has said, though she salvages her own self-respect by referring to herself as a captive rather than repeating Florus' definition of her as a slave. Blanca Flor's Christian faith and her devotion to Florus thus work in tandem to legitimize her enslavement and make her perform the role of the ideal slave who's willing to fulfill the duty of sacrificing his life for his owners. The emphasis on love and marriage as the necessary co-requisites of freedom for Tarsiana and Blanca Flor delineate the boundaries of when manumission is acceptable. The heroines in the romances win freedom and marriage because of their devotion to the men who own them. Once freed, they prove their devotion a second time by marrying, thus entering into a second contract of obedience with the men they love. The paradoxical conclusion that the only slaves worthy of freedom are those who do not want to be freed because they love their masters provides a fantasy solution to the tension between the Siete Partidas affirmation that liberty is a divine gift and an inherent desire of all humans, and the pragmatic recognition of the economic institution of slavery, by imagining stories where young women, in fact the group most likely to be enslaved in medieval Iberia, are both content with their position and rewarded with eventual freedom without troubling the broader ethical justifications for slavery. In the world of the romances, if not in real life, pimps who force slaves into prostitution are suitably punished, and love triumphs over religion and social class, allowing even slave girls to be señoras in the language of courtly love.
We're just going to move things up a little bit. So we have about 20 minutes for a question and answer session. There's so much to chew on and digest there. But thoughts, questions?
So I'll start with Caitlyn. How do you read the importance of a piece of paper in the hand? It seems it's the only, other than the chains, it's a major attribute in that sort of classical tradition of attributes. Why is it there? Why is it legible?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it enters into some interesting issues about Pezzicar himself as the artist, because he is from Trieste, he speaks Italian, and as far as I know, did not speak English, and so he translated the passage and make sure it's in English and also very, very legible. So when you're looking at the sculpture, it's very deeply incised. You can see it immediately that it's dated, signed, and it reads immediately as the Emancipation Proclamation. But at the same time, there's this disconnect between what the Emancipation Proclamation was and what it did and didn't do, and then the 13th Amendment. And so that he seems to have, in wanting accuracy, also kind of bungled what abolition was and what emancipation was. He titles his sculpture The Abolition of Slavery in the United States, 1863, and that in of itself is kind of a fiction in many ways, as he kind of looks at the emancipation as a symbol, but one that's almost in some ways an empty symbol. He doesn't title his sculpture The 13th Amendment or The Emancipation of 1865. So the text is interesting in that it almost serves in some ways as a reality effect, but in other ways obscuring other issues.
And if I could follow up with just one other question. It's unfortunately not a famous statue.
Right.
Still to this day, the images of the kneeling slave, or the kneeling emancipated slave, are more widely distributed images. How did you come across it, and where is it today? What is its current life, as it were?
Yeah, so the statue, I actually came across it through the print that I showed you at the Philadelphia Centennial, and I've noticed it's appeared on the covers of several edited volumes about slavery and emancipation. It's the cover of Eric Foner's Forever Free, and it's also the cover of an edited volume in Italy about slavery and freedom. And so I've noticed it's almost become, the print itself has had this currency of signifying something about freedom and slavery that other sculptures, such as the kneeling slave, don't. And I was interested in why this print is used and why this statue is continually held up as a symbol of emancipation or abolition, when some of the history behind the sculpture itself seems to suggest a far more complex picture of race and power. And the sculpture is now in Trieste in present-day Italy, and it is displayed in the museum, and a lot of people in the museum kind of are like, why is this here? Who is this guy? The sculptor himself did not create any other statues related to the topic of the U.S., and he was in Rome at the time when a lot of other artists were making monuments to emancipation and abolition. It's when Harriet Hosmer's there, and William Wentworth Story are also making monuments about emancipation. So he's in an international community of artists, and it's possible he would have heard about this there.
Thank you. I think the other thing that just really leapt out in your talk was the way in which Thayer's writing about the model for the statue of Brown, about Brown having no agency,
Right. Yeah.
and about him literally being, even as an emancipated person, still being his bodily gifted for a purpose, and that might be just Thayer's lens, but it's a really interestingly worded passage. Thank you for including that.
Yeah. Well, one would be thanks, but I'm going to restrict that one to India Jackson now. Thanks for all the interesting presentations. I was wondering, and obviously since I'm not American, you know much more about the history of this country than I do. I was wondering about your thesis that mass incarceration has replaced the lynching, so to say, and kind of follow up. And what I'm really interested in is like the structural continuation. However, I wonder if it works here, because isn't it the case that mass incarceration on a lower level than today, but still mass incarceration of blacks, former slaves, began simultaneously with the spread of lynchings, with vagrancy laws. That is, you had both at the same time, which is why I would say there is a direct continuation, of course, from slavery to mass incarceration, but the link here is the incarceration of the former blacks by vagrancy laws and similar mechanisms. And I wonder if the continuation with lynchings would not be police violence today.
So I think that typically when thinking about vagrancy laws and kind of like work camps that people were placed into, that is definitely like a part of the prison industrial complex that we start thinking about mass incarceration, starting with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1981. So that is really kind of where I'm like beginning my analysis of mass incarceration. And so that is kind of at the very late if I think we could even consider that a part of what we think of as the massive years in which lynching is happening throughout the United States, which really kind of dwindled off in the 1960s. That answers the question.
Yeah, I guess my understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, other people might know the material better, but that it feels to me that mass incarceration was there immediately afterwards, but that what Ronald Reagan introduced was something new again, and then particularly as prisons become privatized and sort of the prison industrial complex, it becomes a greater effect once capitalism gets involved.
So from 1981 to the present, we've had a kind of increase in the prison population from about 700,000 to 2.5 million, right? And that doesn't include people who are on parole or people who are also people who are on parole and people who are in other parts of the I guess prison system as well. And that I think would be another 3.8 million people who are somehow involved or under the system of mass incarceration currently.
May I quickly follow up just to clarify things? First of all, wasn't capitalism involved from the beginning?
Capitalism is always involved here.
No, it wasn't always. Capitalism is a quite recent phenomenon. However,
No, I mean here, it's simply just.
Yeah, but not with regard to slavery. However, it was involved, of course, with the vagrancy laws already. I mean, that was part of the motivation for these laws, renting out black bodies to northern industry. So, I mean, I see the new quality with Reagan, but it's a story where I do not see that it's not a continuation of that already. And the other thing is, with the Reagan laws, how does that connect to lynching? That still is the point where I do not see the continuation to the lynchings. When you say that's what replaces
Reagan laws, it's the threat of mass incarceration that is shaping black identity, and so the idea that one can have their life stolen, their body taken, their family is destroyed, upended, by some accoutrement of mass incarceration, whether that's being directly in prison, whether that's being put on probation, being put on parole, whether that's being, funneled through the school to prison pipeline. So these are the ways in which the increase in incarceration after the election of Reagan. We are 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners, right? And this all comes after Reagan.
If I may, I think also the connection with lynching has to do with the omnipresence, that the idea that it is really at any moment to anyone under any circumstances, and the sheer numbers, which, I see the police violence thing, but I think the level of
It's a looming threat, it's a specter.
Well, and also the continuing echoes afterwards, because this also means disenfranchisement. Once you have, in most states, once there's a felony conviction, you are permanently disenfranchised. So this is a continued method of that also.
Oh, so this is also just a follow-up for Indya. So I'm guessing this is part of a larger project?
Hopefully the first chapter of my dissertation.
Okay, yeah. So I'm wondering how you're going to develop this with gender in mind. So because I'm thinking of portrait distillers, of course, and so I'm just asking you actually to kind of project forward what you think you might be working on into this.
In the future,
Yeah.
I'm not
I don't
that
know if
far.
it's fair,
Yes,
but-
I'm not that far along yet, but definitely, I mean, I intend to include a chapter on Assad Shakur and her kind of relationship to mass incarceration, and also to the threat of being brought back to America after exile to Cuba is where I think I'm taking my research.
Yeah. Are you gonna like think about birth in that, or is that the wrong way to think about gender difference in this? Is that kind of dead? I don't. This is me thinking out loud. I don't know if that's a dead end or not.
Can you say a little bit more?
So I'm
about that?
thinking, the way that I mean, obviously, Hortense Diller's essay is super important and really incredibly rich and rewarding.
She says, "Don't call me an Afro-Pessimist, though." So.
But I'm also thinking of the way that that essay links being a woman to being a mother, right? And so this is actually not even a question. This is just me asking you to think with me about your project and the way that, is it possible then to talk about gender differences without necessarily talking about maternity? Right, do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Better than I do probably.
And so what comes to mind for me, I'm trying to recall some things, but where Saidiya Hartman I think it's Hartman, is discussing the way in which the Middle Passage kind of eviscerated I would say all previous subjectivity. Not to say that it completely eviscerated our ties to Africa, because there's always been that kind of imagination or that imaginary tie or linkage to some place in Africa that we still carry on with us. But that eviscerating power of the Middle Passage also rendered Black people, black subjects, genderless, right, in the Middle Passage. And so I'm not exactly sure what to do with that, but I do think there is something to keep thinking through there. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
I have a question for Rebecca, kind of continuing on this conversation about gender, and I was really struck by the end of your talk how you're drawing this comparison, this transition from escape of slavery to marriage, which I'm assuming in the Middle Ages was its own kind of bonds position of whether or not women had, what kind of agency women had within that legal institution. It was itself a legal institution, and so that prompted two questions, which is sort of like how other romances deal with marriage as a legal institution and what the relationship is to that within these that focus on slavery, and then parallel for romances that are depicting male slaves, if there's not a similar kind of avenue for recuperation of that subject out, because the laws of marriage would be very different.
Okay, well, I guess, first of all, not to do the medieval geek out thing, but if you're thinking about within the context of courtly love, you're actually thinking mostly outside of marriage. The courtly lover, the standard thing of being the slave of the beloved, is actually that the lady is of higher rank. This is the sort of junior knight errant who falls in love with the unattainable, usually already married lady, and goes through all kinds of suffering, and this is somehow strange and chaste. So it is, I think, somewhat striking, actually, because there is this convention of being the servant of the beloved, which makes sense if you're talking about, in fact, the lady of the castle and some random vassal of her husband's, which does not make sense emphatically in this. There's also actually some very interesting, and I am not an expert in this, but there's some very interesting stuff in terms of what some Hispanists are doing now with influences of Arabic love poetry on specifically Spanish literature, because there is a similar tradition of sort of courtly love in classical Arabic poetry, where in fact the genders are reversed, or again, I don't have Arabic, so I'm working with secondary sources, but the gender of the lady is actually, she's treated as master, not even as mistress. So that's a very sort of strange side effect. In terms of how other romances deal with marriage and sort of masculine, usually I can't think off the top of my head, and I'm really not an expert, I can't think of a romance where the hero, who's, you know, the young knight, is actually a slave. There are times when they're captured temporarily, but this is a very temporary thing. Usually the issue is they have to have adventures and kill giants and, you know, do cool CGI movie effects. In the ones that do end with marriage, they tend to end with marrying up, as it were. But that's usually just sort of an advance in economic standing. And you have some weird, you have some very strange stuff, and it depends, again, once you're going outside of Spain as a language group. This isn't really, I'm thinking about Spain now, it isn't really a slavery romance per se, but there is a very strange series of cycle called Moderator, where, or no, it's not Moderator, it's Bernardo del Carpio, where the hero is imprisoned for a really long time, like 20 years or something like this, and he is eventually set free by his bastard son, who is half Muslim. So these are also complete soap operas. I mean, absolutely, yeah. They get totally crazy in what I didn't say about all of these stories, because I made them sound very grim. They're tremendous fun. I mean, there's everything in the kitchen sink in all of these stories. So, but yeah, that answers that.
I said, in modern romance novels, you'll find that there's a big fantasy thing. But that's a whole other story.
Really?
I think we have time for one really quick question, if anyone has one.
Back to Caitlyn. So you included the portrait of Kincaid at the beginning from the Amistad ship, and as soon as I saw that, all I could think of that is how he's modeled as this Roman statesman. And then you frequently mention Winkelmann throughout your talk, and he's an important classical scholar as well. So I was wondering if you could talk more about this transition from using the classicizing method of looking at slaves or positioning slaves' body to this the modernist depiction of slaves.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. That was definitely an illusion that a lot of people in the 19th century picked up on when they were looking at the Jocelyn painting or the prints of the painting. And that was probably something that was also in Jocelyn's mind as he produced the image. It was commissioned by a Philadelphia abolitionist, and he painted the picture. And a lot of people talked about how he looked like this Roman orator with kind of the toga and then holding the staff, which is a piece of sugar cane. They talked about how kind of there was this melding of kind of a contemporary context as well as this classicizing context. And I've noticed in also other slave narratives and other stories of slave revolts and rebellions in the 19th century, oftentimes there will be an allusion to the heroes or the leaders of those revolts as they make allusion to classical sculptures. They'll talk about how someone looked Herculean. And I think that one can think about kind of the discourse of 19th century, and I'm not a literature expert by any means, but how there are certain tropes in 19th century American literature that orators are drawing upon, or authors are drawing upon in looking to the classical past. And I think that there's definitely this connection and something that people are thinking about.
Can we thank all of our panelists?